You're listening to Myers-Briggs Question Corner with Edythe Richards.
Hello, and welcome to Myers-Briggs Question Corner. I'm Edythe Richards, and I'm a practitioner and avid user of both the Myers-Briggs and Emotional Intelligence 2.0 assessments. A common question I hear relates to the connection between these two instruments, and that's what I'll be addressing in today's episode. In the first portion of this podcast, I'll address the Myers-Briggs assessment, explain what it measures, and provide a brief introduction to the 4 dichotomies. In the second portion, I'll explain the Emotional Intelligence 2.0, or EQI assessment, which is the Reuven Bar-On model, and what it measures. In the third and final portion, I'll link the Myers-Briggs dichotomies to the elements of emotional intelligence where applicable. Let me start with a brief overview of the Myers-Briggs. Now, there's been a lot of narrative about Myers-Briggs being outdated and useless and just not worth the price. And I've addressed these issues, some of which are legitimate concerns, while some are just myths, in previous episodes. Where a lot of confusion about the pseudoscience behind the Myers-Briggs comes into play is in terms of what exactly is being measured. And the Myers-Briggs has come under fire for a lot of this. It measures our preferences, not our abilities, and our preferences are on a pretty broad spectrum. The assessment itself is forced choice, meaning you have to choose A or B, and your choices are ranked. And that's how you get your 4-letter Myers-Briggs type. Like any assessment, the Myers-Briggs is a tool, but it's not a predictive tool, and it should never be used as such. It can't predict any type of success, career, relationship, or other. What it actually measures is your preference on 4 broad-based scales of personality. But a preference is merely a preference. It doesn't mean you actually behave that way all of the time. Where the value of the Myers-Briggs really is in understanding yourself, your motivations, communication style, decision-making style, and lifestyle. And in doing so, you'll be more empowered to make good choices, especially with regards to your career choice, your workplace, and also in how you approach and relate to people with different styles. Briefly, there are 4 scales of the Myers-Briggs. Extroversion and introversion is the first, and this measures how you prefer to be energized. Do you prefer to spend time in the outer world of people and things, or the inner world of thoughts and reflections? Second is sensing or intuition. Do you pay more attention to information coming from your 5 senses, or do you pay more attention to the patterns and possibilities you see in the information you get? Third is thinking or feeling. Do you put more weight on objective facts and principles, or personal concerns and the people involved in your decisions? Fourth is your lifestyle orientation. Do you prefer a structured and planned lifestyle or a flexible and adaptable lifestyle? There's no right or wrong, and there's no one personality type that's any better or any worse than any other. The real value in the Myers-Briggs, or any assessment for that matter, is gained through a conversation with an interpreter who can put that information into a context that's meaningful and useful to you where you are at this point in your life. Let's talk about emotional intelligence, which we've been hearing a lot about since Daniel Goldman published his book, Emotional Intelligence: Why It Can Matter More Than IQ in 1995. Simply put, emotional intelligence, or EQ as I like to call it, is a set of skills that help you recognize, understand, and manage your emotions and use them effectively to produce the behavior that you want. So we can think of it as using emotions to enhance our reasoning. And people who can do this skillfully can better manage stress, navigate relationships, interact with others, and manage their own emotions. If you have active EQ, you are most likely attuned to the people around you, so you consider their emotions as well as your own when you make decisions and go about your life. If we think about it, emotions are one of the main things that disrupt communications and persuasions. And when people are upset at each other, being rational goes out the window, whether we're aware of it or not. When we can control our emotions, we have a better chance of getting our points across more effectively. And when we can sense the emotions of others, we're better able to draw conclusions about what's going on with them, what they may be feeling, and relate to them in a meaningful way. In this way, we can build bridges and overall facilitate better, more productive interactions. The model of emotional intelligence that I use in my work is the Reuven Bar-On model, EQI 2.0. This model consists of the 16 elements of emotional well-being that most contribute to our interpersonal success, effectiveness in coping with demands in our environment, and our overall happiness. The tool is constructed and scored on the same model as an IQ test or intelligent quotient, where 100 indicates the mean or the average of the norm group. Two very important points I'd like to mention about EQ. One is that EQ scores change over time, and they should change with development and skill building. Secondly, on this model of emotional intelligence, high scores aren't necessarily a good thing. Any skill, when it's overused, can become a liability. So high range scores on this assessment are in the top quarter of the norm group, and they may indicate above average engagement with a particular element. But the closer that score gets to 130, the more difficult it may be to turn off that element. And that's when our strengths can be taken to an extreme and can work against us. So whenever I give an EQ assessment, I encourage taking a look not at the scores, but at the relationship between elements. And this is a much more powerful and ultimately a much more helpful approach I've found in assessing emotional intelligence. For example, two elements on the EQI 2.0 assessment are assertiveness, which is our ability and tendency to put our needs and our thoughts and opinions out into the world, even when doing so invites opposition or conflict or causes us to take a stand. And empathy, which is our ability and willingness to take notice of and be sensitive towards other people's needs and feelings. Showing up with more assertiveness than empathy suggests that more emphasis may be placed on promoting one's own agenda or their own views than in considering the views and needs of others. On the other hand, showing up with more empathy than assertiveness may indicate placing more emphasis on caring for others than on your own needs. Now, the really important thing about EQ is that unlike IQ, we can change it. And yes, IQ is also important, but EQ is really going to give you the edge because you can develop it. But it's not just the knowledge that's going to change your scores, but it's the action that you take. And what I encourage is finding balance between elements. So what a coaching session around EQ would look like would be discussing ways to enhance or boost the lower elements so that they're in better balance with the others, but at the same time, focusing on existing strengths and not only on fixing deficits. And high scores usually indicate that it's a strength. And using the previous example, it's a strength to be assertive and it's a strength to be empathetic. And very likely people who score high in these areas have gained a lot of their success because of their strengths in those elements. The danger comes again when we over-rely on a particular element, and when other elements are less developed, there's this huge gap between elements. So now I want to move on to the third part of this episode, which is the connection between Myers-Briggs and EQ. As we've seen, they're two very different assessments, and they measure very different things. They are, however, interdependent upon each other. Emotional intelligence helps us to manage our personality and measure our development. Type theory provides a model for understanding how we can best apply our emotional intelligence. When we're talking about personality type, it's not just our four-letter code, but the sum of our preferences and the interaction among them, and expression from that interaction that results from this. And this is known as type dynamics. Type dynamics is the order of our preferences. And there has been some research about the various aspects of emotional intelligence and how it connects to type dynamics. The studies are publicly available online. So if you're tuning in and you've studied Jungian theory, you may be very interested in the data correlating cognitive functions to areas of emotional intelligence. For our purposes today, I want to stick to a higher level and say that any Myers-Briggs type can have high engagement in any facet of emotional intelligence or not, but all 16 types can learn to be more emotionally intelligent. And I think that's where the real value of both assessments comes into play. Granted, some personality types may have an easier time with some elements than others. Where the interplay between MBTI and EQ is, a good analogy is viewing cognitive preferences as primary or secondary responses. It's just a preference. For example, a thinking type or a person who prefers thinking may learn to have better emotional skills than a feeling type or a person who prefers feeling, and therefore may be more engaged with the element of empathy on the EQ assessment, precisely because he or she has put effort into learning to behave in a certain way. And it works the same with any dichotomy of Myers-Briggs and any element on the emotional intelligence assessment. It really depends solely on the individual, and it should be evaluated on a case-by-case basis, not on the basis of Myers-Briggs types. As I've mentioned in previous episodes, there's so much variation within one personality type, and it really does come down to individual preferences. The last point I'll mention before closing is a question I often get. Which assessment is better? Or which one do you prefer? And I honestly can't choose because they both have their attributes, and it would depend on the information I'm trying to obtain which assessment I'd recommend, or another one completely. In an ideal world, I'd love to use both in a coaching session, starting with Myers-Briggs to focus on style and preferences with the hope that my client would feel validated and able to acknowledge what is most natural. We could then look at the EQI 2.0 assessment for behavioral competencies and areas of strength, as well as areas that need improvement. Folks, thanks so much for tuning in to another episode of Myers-Briggs Question Corner. If you found this content valuable, please give us a share on social media. And if you have a question you'd like me to answer on air, please get in touch at atopcareer.com. I'm Edythe Richards, and I'll see you next week. Until then, stay healthy and be well.
Thanks for listening to this episode. If you'd like to hear more, or you'd like to submit a question yourself, then you can find us at www.atopcareer.com. Until next time. MBTI and Myers-Briggs are registered trademarks of the MBTI Trust.